Hi everyone, welcome back. We are working on workload optimization for SharePoint, and now we're going to discuss planning high availability. So, Brian, why is this important?
Well, most users want access to their content. I don't understand why, but they do.
Yeah.
An important thing is, too, is we have to understand, we're always looking for the 5 nines. 99.99% of the time, we want to be able to get access to our content. So we do so by setting up high availability. And just like we talked about initially, you got to plan, you got to plan, you got to plan again. I'm going to be emphasizing that throughout the entire course. And this, as Christina mentioned, we're going to focus on the planning for the high availability, because this is a make or break. This could be a resume producing event if you don't have a high availability situation configured in your farm.
Yes, and it's really important to have a lot of different considerations for high availability, the reasons why or why not you would want to have it on. So what we're going to talk about now is defining that high availability and also those considerations, as I mentioned. The SharePoint Farm high availability, fault tolerance.
Fault tolerance.
And then we're going to do a little demo for that. And there's going to be some interesting things you're going to have to consider, especially if you're going to go for a hybrid environment. So tell us a little bit about redundancy.
Well, redundancy is the key thing. We're going to be talking, the next 4 modules, we're talking about high availability. We're going to talk about disaster recovery, backups, restores. There's one word that defines all that or makes it all happen, and that's redundancy. And whether it be redundancy with servers, with the databases, if you're talking about database level, cables that are special cables, you have to have the special cable. I have a phone, it's a 6S phone, and I have a certain holster that I like. And I keep one in stock at home every day or every time. I broke one a week and a half ago. And as soon as I got home, I had the one that I had in stock. I put it on and started using it, and I ordered another one and had it shipped to the house. So it's redundancy, making sure you have the tools that you need for recovering. And redundancy is the easiest way over the next 4 modules. Always keep in the back of your mind, the key word is redundancy for what we're going to be talking about, specifically high availability. And as you can see here, it's the ability of a system to continue functioning. Now, it may not be as fast as it was, but it's going to continue functioning by providing those resources to its users. And even when a failure occurs, and it could be a hardware failure, it could be software, it could be a specific application, it could be search isn't working, it could be user profile service isn't working. We have redundancy to allow that failover to kick in for us, so that functionality continues on for us.
And it limits the crisis to your users. Things that because they want to be able to get to the content, they want to be able to use these different tools and services. So it's really important to have the high availability just for your users to feel more at ease with using the product.
And that's the thing, is keeping the end users happy. I mean, bottom line, we got to keep them happy. They're the ones that sign our paychecks, all said and done. So let's look at some characteristics of high availability. We want to reduce the number of points of failure. So if we have a single server in SQL Server, we have a point of failure there, because if I lose that SQL Server, I have no way to get to my database. And as we know, 94.5% of all the content in SharePoint is stored in SQL Server.
Yeah.
But we also know 78.3% of all statistics are made up on the spot. So we have to have, to avoid single points of failure. And if there is a failure, we have to make sure it's fairly transparent to our users. They don't really see what's happening. It's like, man, the system seems to be slower today or for this hour or two. And them not even realize that, well, we went from 2 SQL servers down to 1, or 4 SQL servers down to 2, whatever it may be in a cluster configuration. But we'll talk about some of these characteristics in more detail. But again, it'll continue to function. It may be a little bit slower, and that makes your farm resilient, which means anything that happens, you've got coverage for it. You've got redundancy again. And but we also, at the same time, we want to minimize it. We don't want to say, well, it's like an insurance policy. You have it, but you don't really want to use it, because usually if you're going to use it, something bad happened. So we want to use this or create this environment that provides a high availability, but it should be more of an insurance policy. It's there just in case something does happen. And we have to be prepared for it too, and we'll talk about that. I'm going to harp on you about that. A lot of people have a disaster recovery plan in place, and then something happens, and like, oh, those backup tapes are empty. Or that disk drive that we're restoring our backup, so we move that to a different location. and they are running around trying to figure out where their backups are. So we have to make sure we periodically test. We know exactly what we're going to do so we can take quick action and effectively restore whatever we've lost. It could be different levels. So as far as what we have lost,
Right.
you know, as far as what a disaster is concerned, and that's kind of jumping into the next module. But so I'll leave that one alone. But so when it comes to planning, which is what we're doing, the 3 Ps: planning, planning, and more planning. We've got to define and quantify the availability goals. It may be in a situation. I was working at a job out in it's in Huntsville. I can't think of the military base. And I came in. I was doing some consulting work for them, and I got there on a Monday. Went home over the weekend. I was actually a couple weeks since I had been there, and the guy says, "Oh, by the way, our SharePoint farm went down last Thursday. When we get a chance, can we look at that?" We're working on a different project. So their availability wasn't that big a deal for them. It's been down since Thursday. I'm coming in Monday, continue on with some work, and they're like, "Hey, can we look at that sometime this week?" You know. So we need to define what do we need? What do we mean by availability? Maybe we may be okay to be down for a day or 3 hours or 4 hours, but we have to figure that out. And when we're looking at that, it's not just the IT's decision, as you can see in bullet 3 here. It's business requirements.
Yep.
Is it okay for the business to be unavailable for 4 hours and not be able to access their content in SharePoint?
Right.
What's the service level agreements? Maybe we're providing, we're a vendor for a company. What did we commit to them? A 4-hour window that they can only be down, but for their content can be unavailable. What are the IT support capabilities? Maybe they were a little stingy on the budget, and they said, "Look, we really want an SLA of 4 hours, but kind of really can't afford what you're offering here. So what's our second option here?" So costs are always a big part of high availability planning considerations.
And in that planning consideration, you want to make sure you have key stakeholders for those departments that could be impacted if they significantly use the SharePoint environment. I can think of an organization I once worked for. And they were a financial institution, and they did a lot of their QA processing of their loans, like did these different activities happen on these different loans. And so they needed high availability, they needed access, and they also needed to have the auditing trails of all this information as well. So it was a high risk situation that they needed to be able to have access to, but they didn't have, they only had me as their SharePoint support person. And
Had to do everything.
I had to do all of it.
Right.
And so even the help desk, there was no support at the help desk level to be able to support if we needed to move something, change databases and whatnot. So the SLA was a couple days just because it was down to one person.
Exactly. Yeah, it's everyone's requirements are different, so make sure you understand that. A lot of people think, so an IT pro comes in, I got to make sure this thing is never down. Then you start talking to CIO, CFO, EIO, all them, and they're like, "Yeah, it's okay if it's a few hours or 4 hours. Well, I can make it I can make it available 99.99% of the time, but it's going to cost this much. Or we can make it 75% of the time, it's going to cost this much." And they have to decide what's most important to them.
Right, and on top of that, the size of the farm, how many SQL servers that you've got, making sure that is identified. Because, again, it goes back to that same situation that I've had in the past where they had high availability, but they had dev, test, stage, and production all on one server with one SQL database. That's bad.
Yes, that's an RP, resume producing event.
Yes.
It happens once, and an IT guy is going to say, our manager, "What are you doing to this? No redundancy."
Right, exactly. And even they didn't have the disaster recovery put in place either. So it was very challenging.
Yep, definitely. So with what we've just talked about, design must include eliminate that single point of failure. Don't have a single server, SQL server. Don't have a single instance of a service application. Right. Don't have a single web front-end server that's hosting your distributed cache. Implement a rapid detection failure. So we need to know, it's like, I don't want to get a call at lunch, say, "Dude, our system's been down for 2 hours. Why are you at lunch as an IT pro and not working on this problem?" So make sure you have a way that you're notified if there is an issue, and you're able to quickly isolate that issue and then have a plan in place. We're going to talk about recovery plans shortly on recovering from that disaster or that issue that we're encountering. A lot of the times it's going to be either hardware or software, or it could be both. So we got to be planning for what if, worst case, we lost a system and when we started, we recovered the other system because we haven't tested. It's only not the only reason. One of the reasons it wouldn't happen would happen is, and then that operating system fails because there's some update that wasn't applied. So that's why I'm going to harp on you, test your recovery process as we go out through the next few modules, because that and redundancy are the two key things that are going to keep you employed.
Yes, and definitely consider also since that we are talking about an on-prem scenario, that your data centers, whether they be physically on location in your buildings, and then also like, do you have another one in a different city? You know, because there is natural disasters, not just hardware and software disasters that we have to think about.
Yeah,
so.
location. Absolutely. So SharePoint Farm high availability. As we can see here, we've got a few options that we need to be concerned with here. And we've been talking mostly about the SQL Server databases, but you'll see here that we have our web front ends, and they've set up 4 web front ends here. So they have availability, they have high availability, they have, what's that word I was using? Oh yeah, redundancy, 4 of them. So if I lose web's front end server 1, we've got web's front end server 3 maybe that are set up to talk to each other. But in addition to that, if we go into the second column, we have these guys here. We have our search query. We have multiple index partitions, and we also have all the other components on multiple servers. We get in the back here, this is what we've been focusing on mostly. It's the database, because again, most of our content is stored there. Whether we set up clustering or mirroring or always on availability groups, we have to have some sort of redundancy for that. And then down on the bottom, we have the virtual environment. This doesn't all have to be physical servers. We can take advantage of virtual, like Hyper-V. So we have to decide as we create our high availability, maybe we want to use Azure and take advantage of their availability options. I mean, you can choose where you want your backups. Your backups can be in Australia, they can be in Japan, they can be anywhere you want. And Christina already alluded to.
Running SharePoint in Azure is ridiculously amazing. It's easy to set up. It's easy to maintain. And like you said, the SQL servers, where do you want them? Yeah. It's amazing. I absolutely love it.
Yeah, some of the configuration options, like, wow, I can have a farm in Japan and I got my backups in Australia. And you mentioned earlier about location. I speak at a lot of conferences, and I talk about the idea of where do I want my backups for my database. I'm kind of jumping into an upcoming module, but location, and we'll talk about that when we get to that module. But a lot of people will back it up to the same server where their production databases are. And I'm like, dude, what if that server crashes, like totally crashes? You've lost your backups and you've lost your production server. So we'll talk about that in an upcoming module, but some ideas to take into consideration.
Right.
Fault tolerance for high availability. We've been mentioning databases quite a bit. Fault tolerant databases, we talked about the fact we can use SQL Server failover clustering. That's one option. We'll expand on these in a little bit more detail. Right. Always on availability groups and SQL Server high availability database mirroring.
That's really important.
That is. It's really, very important to make sure that we have, and all 3 of these lead to one word that we've talked about previously: redundancy. Failover clustering is multiple servers hosting the same content. Availability groups, multiple instances of that content. It's always going to come back to the simple word of redundancy. Backup and restore operations. A lot of people they do backups daily, every day, every week, every month, but they never test the restore solution.
Yeah.
And then they come in and they got a Post-it note stuck to their forehead, and the CIO walks in. What are you doing? It's like, oh, I'm doing a recovery. Well, what's the Post-it note? Oh, that's my steps I need to take. Or what's worse, I've had people do, is the CIO walks in, they don't know who it is. Some dude walks in and says, hey, so I hear SharePoint's down. How long is it going to be? It's like, I don't know. It's been a couple of months. It's been 2 years. Proud as a peacock. We've not ever had a problem. The I don't know who you just said that I just said was a resume producing event. I'm going to hang out to figure it out to get this farm restored. But after that, I'll probably walk to the door, because I should know whether I lose a database, a full server, whether it be a web front-end server, an application server. I should have an idea if I'm testing my restore strategy. Again, I'm getting into future modules here. But we're talking about the idea of you got to test your restore strategy.
And it's really important. Again, it goes back to that idea of documenting. So you can plan, but you got to make sure you document it so that you don't have that resume producing event of I don't know. Right. And you don't want somebody to walk in, senior leadership to walk in and say, hey,
What's happening?
What's going on?
Exactly.
You want to have an action plan so that you can react quickly.
Yeah. And SharePoint 2016 supports what's called a stretched farm. And as you can see, the requirements for that highly consistent intra-farm latency with 1 millisecond and 99.9%, 1 millisecond connectivity 99.9% of the time over a 10-minute period. And you need a bandwidth speed of 1 gigabit per second or higher. So these have to be very close to each other. And as you'll see here, this is an example. And you can see here that we've got our redundant front-end servers. We have our application servers, redundancy. We have our SQL server set up here, redundancy, and a mirror of those SQL servers set up here with a witness server in the middle. So if this guy detects we're not getting any action from the primary servers, it knows to redirect the request to the secondary servers. And up front, we need some way to do that redirection, and we have a DNS or a load balancer here, a hardware load balancer. That's detected as like, dude, that SQL Server cluster is not responding. We're now going to redirect those requests. It's also up there to say, all right, I don't want all my front end server, I don't want all my requests from my front end servers going into server 1. First request to server 1, then server 2, server 3, server 4. So it does truly load balancing for you.
And something to consider with this high availability is that if you're planning a hybrid environment, your CIO has come to you and say, hey, we want to do SharePoint Online too, Office 365. Well, you're going to have to consider the 99.9% uptime. You're going to have to consider speed. You're going to have to consider this failover potential that you can quickly switch between things, and this mirroring that's going to happen. So having it set up and into a stretched farm scenario really will help prepare you and your on-premise farm for SharePoint Online connectivity for hybrid.
Well, let's take a peek. We've talked about a lot. We don't expect you to remember all this. So we're going to jump out to a site where you can explore this information. And I'm just going to introduce you to the site. Now, this will be part of your resources that are associated with this course. But this is a site that you'll want to visit and take advantage of when it comes to high availability to get some ideas. So here we are on the supported high availability and disaster recovery options. We're going to talk about DR in the next module, in fact. But I want to introduce you to this site. As we scroll down here, there's an introduction. It talks about, and it's broken out into SharePoint Server 2016 system databases. It talks about service application databases, your SQL Server system databases, and even down to the SQL Server reporting databases. So if you're looking for high availability in these areas to support SharePoint Server 2016, this is the guide I want you to spend some time on. And it's quite lengthy, so I'm not going to go through the entire thing, but it talks about the SharePoint Server 2016 system databases. And it comes out of out of the gate, and it's talking about the configuration database. And it tells you what options, what's the purpose, what's the category, support SQL Server 2014 with Service Pack, so the supporting capabilities. And let me scroll down a little bit more. Support for always-on availability groups. And also talks about asynchronous mirror or log shipping and asynchronous commits for disaster recovery. So per database in the SharePoint space, it tells you what's the best criteria for providing that high availability.
Right, and the reasons why this is also an important resource for you is because you're not going to remember everything.
No.
And if you've got senior leadership asking to put us into a hybrid scenario and you have to now configure high availability, well, you need to know the different constraints and things to prepare your environment for high availability. So it's nice to have these resources readily at hand.
And again, they'll be as part of the extra resources for the course. And then the next one is Central Admin Content Database. I'm not going to stop at every one of these. I'm going to go into the categories. Then you have your database, your content databases for your web apps. And then it goes into each of the service application databases. So this one guide, because it's going to give you all sorts of information about high availability for every web app, for your system databases, for your service applications, and it even drills down to the SQL Server. I'm not going to drag you through the rest of it, but please take the time to reference this when you're getting ready to set up your high availability or plan for high availability for SharePoint 2016.
Very good. So in this particular module, we defined what high availability was. We had some planning considerations. We discussed the SharePoint Farm high availability. We also had fault tolerance for high availability, and then we showed you that wonderful resource that will really help you in the long run. So in our next module, we're going to be discussing what again?
Disaster recovery. Just
Disaster recovery.
Unlikely event, something like that happens.
We don't like to think about it, but it's important. So as you're planning your high availability, as we move into our disaster recovery, think about the other things we've talked about. See you soon.